My name is Gray Tuttle. I am the chair of the East Asian Languages and Cultures Department, and I am pleased to be here to introduce John Phan and his fantastic new book. I guess I'll just run down the line of characters, as Bob just said, characteristics that will be used today. David Lurie is a specialist in Japanese literature, linguistics, and history. One of the few of us who's truly interdisciplinary and teaches across the humanities and social sciences divide that the university kind of imposes on the fields of history and literature here. Bob Himes teaches Chinese literature, and Mark Alves is history. I'm sorry. Chinese histories, middle period Chinese history. And Mark Alves teaches at Montgomery College in Maryland. And I did not check with you on your specialty, but I will let you introduce that.
Southeast Asian linguistics with a focus on Vietnamese.
So thank you all for being here today, and I will turn it over to John now to introduce the book.
Thank you so much, Gray. And thanks everybody for being here today. This evening, it's a great honor and a pleasure to discuss the book here at the Heyman Center with such dear and distinguished colleagues. I apologize because I'm going to be reading from the screen, so I'm going to be swiveling a little bit during the presentation. My book is called Lost Tongues of the Red River, Annamese Middle Chinese and the Origins of the Vietnamese Language. And in the broadest possible terms, it's really a book about language and history, or more specifically, what historical linguistics can do to help illuminate, especially the distant past. The geographical region it's focused on is, oh, hi, Tim. Is that Tim? Oh, my God. Is this area here, the Red River Basin, which is modern-day northern Vietnam, where the surrounding area of where Hanoi is today, stretching all the way to the Pearl River Basin, which is where modern-day Guangzhou City is situated, this territory here. So one way to think about what the book is trying to do is to pose the question, why is the Pearl River Cantonese speaking and the Red River Vietnamese speaking? So there's one obvious answer, and that is because the Pearl River is in China. So obviously it's Chinese speaking, and the Red River is in Vietnam. So obviously it's Vietnamese speaking. So if you thought that, that is not an incorrect answer. That's totally true. But of course, that relies on modern lines. Obey. Something's happening, and it's not. There it goes. Modern lines. So that was more effective when it changed, when I wanted it to change. Modern lines, such as the lines that divide the nation state of China from the nation state of Vietnam. And obviously these lines can't even be applied to the recent past, never mind the distant past, right? So that brings me to the first basket of ideas that the book is engaged with. And that is the idea of nationalism and language history, or more specifically, how we should understand the relationship between language and society, culture, and identity. So as has been well documented, the ideal of the nationalist imaginary suggests that a single people or a single ethnicity speaks a single language and undergoes a single shared history together. That's the ideal. For example, the Chinese people speak the Chinese language and have undergone 5,000 years of Chinese history together. So obviously in the modern world, we make allowances for the variation in nation-state configurations. But for some reason, when it comes to language, we tend to cling especially to this nationalist ideal, the ideal of one people speaking one language. The Chinese people ideally speak the Chinese language, right? So this may be a cultural and political reality, and certainly there are policies in place to make this a reality, right? But linguistically and historically, it's untenable. And you don't have to look very carefully at the Chinese language to realize that there is no such thing as a single Chinese language, right? It's a huge language family comprised of many, many diverse languages with speaker populations in the millions. So why is it important to discuss this nationalist idea of a single people speaking a single language, especially when we're looking at the human history, the past? Well, it's because, to put it as simply as possible, language, obey, I don't like this, so annoying. Language does not equal people. That's a really important idea. Language is a communicatory system, and it is not equal a single community of humans that is unchanging. So the history of a language does not equal the history of a people. The history of a language is the history of that system as it changes over time, not the history of a single group of human beings. And that's because humans can and will abandon language, adopt new languages, or sustain multiple languages in their society. That's why it's very important to focus on, to recognize this first point. The history, for example, of the Chinese language is not the history of the Chinese people. Okay, so that is the first important idea that I think the book is trying to convey through the example of the origins of the Vietnamese language, and we'll come back to it towards the end. So to put it simply, modern lines such as those defined by nationalist identities, which are current and relevant, obscure or hide past configurations. And this brings me to the second set of ideas that the book is talking about, and that is the lost worlds or the lost configurations of identity or culture that language or the study of the history of language can help to illuminate, to revive. So again, this is the territory that I'm concerned with here. And to make a lot of very complex history short, that territory was conquered by the Han Dynasty in the 2nd century BC and reconfigured into the southern perimeter of the empire. So this is the southern perimeter of the Han Dynasty, and it was named Zhaozhibu or Zhaoqi, which is the name of the entire region from the Red to the Pearl Rivers. And if you look at the census records from the year 2, you can see that the major demographic center of the far south of the empire is not in the Pearl River or in the Chengdu Plain, but it's in the Red River Plain. It's in modern northern Vietnam. Indeed, the Red River Plain was the site of the most important economic center of the far south for the entire Han Dynasty. Not just the Han Dynasty, but it really continued until virtually the end of the Tang Dynasty. That's about 1,000 years of history until the rise of Guangzhou in the middle of the Tang. So why is that important? Well, first of all, unsurprisingly, we find evidence for a Sinitic society developing, rising up, growing in that region, the region of modern-day northern Vietnam. And we see lots of material evidence for that society. And the question that the book poses is, of course, who were those people, right? How did they understand themselves? And most importantly, what did they speak? And what does the answer to that question tell us about human history in the region? So this is the final basket of ideas that the book really engages with, the most concrete basket, the linguistic question, right? What were the languages spoken in that region? And what does that tell us about human history? What are the lost tongues of the Red River? Oh, it really turned that into a very ugly font, so I apologize for that. It's much more beautiful on my computer. So as you know, the Pearl River is Cantonese speaking and the Red River is Vietnamese speaking today. And to make another very complicated story short that Mark can tell you about, Vietnamese is not genealogically related to Cantonese or any other Chinese language. It's an Austroasiatic language. But if you take a typical sentence from Vietnamese, like this one, it's a very old sentence if you pay attention to the content. These are the words of Chinese origin in that sentence. So this is a newspaper article, so the number of Chinese words is higher than normal speech, but even in normal speech, the number of Sinitic words is very high. Not only the lexicon, but the grammatical structure, and most importantly, the phonological structure and forms of the Vietnamese language are deeply, deeply similar to the Chinese languages. And the question is why? How do we explain that? So the answer is right in the title of the book. The answer is Annamese Middle Chinese and something we call language shift. So this is the main argument of the book. So if you zoom in again on this region that's the focus of the book, and on the western half, the book is really arguing that we have to posit the existence of a Chinese language, a Sinitic language, whose features are native to the Red River Plain. And not only that, but the major speaker population of that dialect was right there in the Red River Plain, that big southern city. Nowhere else, nowhere further north. Right? That's the home of that language. And it was spoken alongside another language, which is the genealogical ancestor of modern day Vietnamese, which I call Northern Vedic. Okay, so if you're thinking to yourself, I get it. Over the first 1,000 years, there's Vietnamese people and there's Chinese people, and they're talking to each other in this region. Then you do listen to the first part of the talk. Remember, language does not equal people. That's not what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting a single bilingual society comprised of individuals who speak both languages to varying degrees at multiple levels of society. Okay, that's the idea. There's lots of other languages spoken in this region, but we don't have time to talk about them, so just ignore them. So the question is, what happened? What happened to all of those Chinese speakers, or what happened to that Chinese language, right? That's the question. The answer is language shift. There it is. And language shift, very simply, is the process by which this bilingual society became a monolingual society. It lost one of the languages. So there was a bilingual Annamese Middle Chinese speaker population that spoke Northern Vedic with a deeply Sinitic accent, right? And over many generations, this single community abandons spoken Annamese Middle Chinese and becomes monolingual in that deeply Sinicized Northern Vedic language. And that, stole my own thunder. That Sinicized dialect of Northern Vedic is the origin of the Vietnamese language. That's the origin of the Vietnamese language as we know it today. That explains all those Sinitic features of the modern Vietnamese language. So in other words, those Chinese speakers didn't go anywhere. They became Vietnamese speakers and they create the Vietnamese language in this process of language shift. So if you want a modern example for how a language can be deeply, deeply hybridized by pervasive multilingualism, the best example is something that we call Singlish. Singlish is the dialect of English that's native to Singapore, and it's totally fascinating. But once again, I don't have any time to talk about it, so just look it up at the end of the day. It's very, very interesting, and it's a good example. So let me just conclude with a couple remarks. So we have the situation with this big southern city, and now we can put Annamese Middle Chinese on the southwestern part of that map. What happens, of course, is that the Tang Dynasty falls, and that integrated territory of the Red and Pearl Rivers, it breaks right in half into western and eastern halves, and they promptly go to war with one another. That's the war between Annam and the Southern Han. And all through that time, Annamese Middle Chinese is still spoken. Eventually, the Song Dynasty will reconstitute the empire, including the eastern half of the old territory, but not the western half, not Annam. And instead, an independent kingdom will rise up in that area that will eventually be called Dai Viet, the first independent Vietnamese polity. But the key here is that just because an independent Vietnamese kingdom arises does not mean that Annamese Middle Chinese disappears overnight. It took generations, probably even centuries, for Annamese Middle Chinese to eventually disappear, giving us the modern distribution of languages where the Pearl River is Cantonese speaking and the Red River is Vietnamese speaking. So this is the last slide. Just a couple of thoughts. Who were the Chinese and who were the Vietnamese in this history, right? Neither yet existed, not at least as we understand the nationalist concepts today. Neither one. That means the Chinese didn't exist either, by the way, okay? Rather, the national identities we recognize today were formed out of complex, diverse, and overlapping forces. Culture does not obey national lines, and language contains and expresses a multitude of identities. Language is not indelibly tied to political or cultural identity. But language, when it survives, can often reveal the intricacies of human interactions over thousands of years of history. Thank you very much. And 20% off. Yeah. Thank you very much.
I'm grateful to Gray Tuttle for the kind introduction. I'm David Lurie, a colleague of John's, and I'm also, in addition to being his colleague and therefore delighted that he's written such an incredible book, I'm also a specialist in the history of writing and literacy in pre-modern East Asia, specifically in Japan. So I have a great deal of points of overlap in regard to this, and I want to talk about some of those in the time that I have. Gray was very kind to refer to me as someone with training in linguistics. I actually have only dabbled in linguistics, so I'm going to defer to the two gentlemen to my right who know infinitely more than I do about historical linguistics to talk about those specific elements of this project. One of the reasons that this book is very hard to respond to is that it's not one book. It's more like an anthology of monographs, each of them good enough to be a monograph on its own. I think there's maybe 4 or 5 incredible books in this one volume. It's a historical linguistics textbook of great value and accessibility about not one, but 2 major language families. It presents an extensive argument, which John just recapped very eloquently, about bilinguality in the ancient Red River Plain, including the effective rediscovery of a lost form of the Chinese language, which by itself, I mean, this book does so many other things, but that by itself would be the kind of headline item. And it's also the best account, I think maybe the only account that we have at this point in English of the origins of the Vietnamese language. It is also a treatise on writing and literacy in pre-modern East Asia. It's many other things, but I'll stop with that list. And this book makes a number of really crucial interventions. I think it models an approach to interdisciplinarity that we can all learn from. We often think about interdisciplinarity in terms of consumption, that the interdisciplinary scholar is a sort of whale shark who goes out and engulfs plankton from various different oceans. And John has certainly done that. I think there's work extensive. The bibliography is also kind of incredible. There's extensive research in at least 5 languages represented in the scholarly apparatus and in the arguments and footnotes, et cetera, throughout the book. But this is also something that interdisciplinary books are much less frequently, which is that it models how to write interdisciplinary work in a way that it's accessible to a large community of different scholars coming from different areas with different perspectives. And this is a book that I think if there's anyone here who can read the entire book and understand all of it, other than John, it might be Bob Himes right here. But I think many people will find some aspects of it touching on areas that they have less familiarity with. I certainly did myself, but it's written in a way that it keeps it maximally open to readers coming from various different perspectives, and it is incredibly generous in the way that not only it acknowledges past scholarship that John is working with, but also the future scholars who will come to this book and build on it. And I think that fundamental generosity, it's not just a generosity of saying where you got the plankton from, it's a generosity of creating a kind of structure for people who will come after you. It also is an incredibly courageous book. It goes against investments that people have, modern kind of nationalist investments that people have in their own identities that are very difficult to challenge, that potentially involve a kind of blowback to the scholar who takes up arms against them. To a much lesser degree, I've also struggled in my work with how you chart a course between a kind of Sino-centric nationalism that wants to claim all pre-modern East Asian literacy as a kind of Chineseness versus local nationalisms, Japanese or Korean or Vietnamese nationalisms that are desperately desirous of reading kind of modern nation state categories back into the past, and how you can say as true as you can to the forms of identity and forms of literacy and forms of literature, communication, and so on in the pre-modern world while charting your kind of course between these modern nationalist investments is incredibly hard to do, and it can be quite dangerous. And I think John has been, I think we should recognize his courage in the forthrightness that he's taken this problem on. I only have a few minutes left, and I want to spend that time talking about the part of this book which resonates most with my own research interests, which is the way that John works with the problems of literacy and writing in the pre-modern history of East Asia. And he's dealing with a particular problem that pertains for anyone who works with any part of the region, modern as well as pre-modern, I would say, which is the relationship between vernacular languages and vernacular forms of literature and the existing kind of classical or cosmopolitan register, which I will just call literary Sinitic without explaining why. If that comes up again, we can talk about it later, or John can explain better than I can. And I think there's been a tendency to understand this relationship between literary Sinitic and the non-Sinitic or local vernaculars by really just focusing on Japanese and Korean. And Vietnamese has been left out of the picture. And this book is part of a constellation of work by John and other scholars, particularly by John, that really allow us to put Vietnam into the larger East Asian picture. And it inevitably makes that a kind of fully three-dimensional picture for the first time. There are a lot of assumptions that we make when we're looking only at Japanese and Korean sources that once we start looking at Vietnam, those assumptions are revealed as kind of path-dependent and local rather than features of the Chinese periphery. But there's another element of this struggle to figure out the relationship between vernacular, the spoken vernaculars, and then written representations of vernacular language and the sort of classical literary Sinitic register, which is that it attempts to sort of generalize about this or theorize about this tend to founder once you start looking into China. Like, we all know there's a problem here, and our colleague Shang Wei wrote a very important piece, which is in one of the important precursors to some of the work that John is doing here about Baihua, the concept of vernacular fiction or vernacular, the mode of writing that vernacular fiction is written in, and basically challenging a lot of the ways people have assumed that Baihua is kind of representative of spoken language or kind of transcriptive of spoken language. But once you've followed Xiangwei down that path, which I think we have to, we're left with this huge problem of how we think about the relationship between literary Sinitic and the spoken language internal to China. And that's a problem that I tried to theorize in an article I wrote several years ago, and ended up just kind of waving my hands and avoiding it, like sort of saying in the notes, like, this is a big problem. Xiangwei kind of upset the apple cart. I don't know what to do now. We're just going to kind of look over here. Don't look at this footnote anymore. But with this kind of characteristic courage, John has gone directly into the center of this problem, and he has put us into an entirely new footing in thinking about the relationship between literary Sinitic and spoken Chinese by moving us back before the emergence of vernacular fiction and kind of taking us away from that area and looking more at really the fundamental philological apparatuses that allowed literary Sinitic to function as a medium for poetry and prose for millennia. Certainly for well over a millennium in terms of the kind of period that he's dealing with. And this allows us to see that the relationship between spoken language and written language, between spoken Chinese and literary Sinitic, is not an exception, and it's also not a transcendental case, that it's the part of the terrain where we need to address this problem. And by going into this in great detail, John solves a lot of problems that he has in terms of talking about this relationship between literary Sinitic and Vietnamese, and also literary Sinitic and this new form of spoken Chinese that he's discovered. But he also reorients this entire kind of multi-language, multi-area, multidisciplinary conversation in ways that I think will be bearing fruit for many years to come. I've run out of time. There's a lot more that I would like to say about this book, but it's truly fantastic, and I encourage everyone to read it, no matter what you're interested in. You will not understand all of it unless you're Bob Himes, but you'll understand a lot more than you think you will if you just pick it up and flip through it, and it's really worth it. It's a truly wonderful book. So thank you, John.
I guess this is on, right? Wow. Well, thank you, David. Thank you, John, before David. It's a real pleasure. It's a privilege to be included in this fan fest, and to find myself joining such an excellent lineup of fanboys celebrating the work of John Phan, specifically his monumental book, Lost Tongues of the Red River. And I've thought a lot about how, in a short allotted time, I might try to convey to people who haven't read the book and who don't necessarily know Vietnamese history or Vietnamese or Chinese linguistic history, just how monumental a project the book seems to me to be. And I think I've decided I can do it best maybe by telling a story, an alternative history really, that imagines a parallel achievement on ground that might be more familiar to educated English speakers. So call my story that you're about to hear a little piece of fanfic. Imagine a young linguistically savvy scholar of European history, and specifically the history of England. But imagine that in the alternative world this scholar lives in, no historical record has survived of the Norman conquest, or of the existence of the Normans as a separate language community, or as a separate and defined group of people at all. There are historical records of individual ruling figures and families in what we now call England, in this alternate world, but those historical records include no mention of what language or languages those figures or the larger communities they lived in and the other communities surrounding them spoke. Perhaps the records are all in Latin and don't betray the existence of any other language, let alone of communities on the ground in England speaking different languages from each other, which we, living outside this imaginary alternative history, know that as of 1066 and for 2 or 3 centuries afterward, the Anglo-Saxon speaking and Norman French speaking communities happened to be. Imagine then that our imagined scholar, I'm sorry, let's call him John Phan, writes a book in which he uses purely linguistic evidence from the structure, phonology, and lexicon of early modern English to reconstruct, virtually out of nowhere, the Normans and their language. And furthermore, reconstructs the fact that it was the Normans' shift as a group and over a period of centuries from their own spoken Anglo-Norman language to the language of the larger English community around them in the process bringing great gobs of their own French into what became their version of that language, that it was that shift by the Normans and the following emulative adoption by the surrounding population of the Normans' version of the language because of their own higher status as the aristocracy of England. It was that process that produced essentially Middle English, a language much more dramatically different from Old English than, say, any of the languages of High German of the stages of High German are from the Old High German that preceded them. All this we largely know happened, though I may be speaking only approximate truth, but we largely know it happened from much richer historical records in the English case, but our imagined scholar had to figure it out from purely linguistic evidence in the descendant language. Imagine somebody doing that. This is what John Phan has done for the history of Vietnamese and Vietnam. Reconstructed from almost purely linguistic evidence the following account, that a previously unknown group of people, at least previously unknown in terms of being a linguistic group, speaking a previously unknown regional variety of Middle Chinese, which he calls Annamese Middle Chinese, were the ruling elite of the Red River Plain in what is now Vietnam as of the 10th century, when that region first moved towards something like political independence, that Middle Chinese speaking elite had been the ruling elite of the region for centuries before, surrounded by a population that spoke a language or languages of the completely unrelated Viet Mong family, and bilingually themselves speaking that language or languages as well, and that certain key events followed. Namely, that across a period of centuries from the 10th to perhaps the late 14th century, that elite shifted from its own Sinitic spoken language to the language of the people around it, but to its own new version of that language, since like the Normans, it brought great gobs of its original language, in this case, Annamese Middle Chinese, into the language it adopted. And that this process of language shift and language death, a point John makes very importantly, since Annamese Middle Chinese, like Anglo-Norman, did not survive these processes, produced, when the surrounding population emulated the new high-status speech, the direct ancestor of the Vietnamese language as we know it. Now, we know that our imagined linguistic historian's reconstruction of the Normans is correct. But in our alternative history, presumably other historians of England and English treated that imaginary scholar's reconstruction of the Normans as a powerful and plausible hypothesis deserving further work. Thus, I suppose, as responsible scholars in this world, we should also treat John's reconstruction of the Annamese Middle Chinese elite of the Red River Plain and of its language shift as a pair of powerful and plausible hypotheses, though hypotheses based on an extraordinary quantity of, to my eye, rigorously considered data. Perhaps Professor Albus, who will speak after me and who knows much more about this than I do, no matter what David says, will have more to say about that. Though I'm certainly not a historian of Vietnam or the Vietnamese language, I personally find the hypotheses persuasive, and I see the book as one of the most startling and impressive acts of creative historical reconstruction that I've ever read. Tempted almost to say reconstruction ex nihilo, except that, of course, language is far from nothing. It's also a very loud challenge, as both John and David have alluded to, challenge to a really refutation of nationalist models of language that have assumed or would assume the Vietnamese language as an eternal, or at least smoothly developing aspect of an equally eternally posited Vietnamese people. If John is right, then the most important single step, and I think he is, by the way, even though I don't have a right to, if John is right, then the most important single step in the development of the modern Vietnamese language was its adoption by a ruling group speaking what a Vietnamese linguist nationalist would regard as a foreign language, and the accompanying massive import of that language's phonological, lexical, and even certain grammatical resources into the resulting language. This is a powerful story, and it's a powerfully important book. Now, you can blame David for what follows, because I said, can I really do this to David? And he said, sure, go ahead. So it's all his fault. I can't close without revealing to John that I've discovered an amazing surviving text that you've never heard of that documents the very transition that you're talking about. It is an actual song sung to their children by the last speakers of Annamese Middle Chinese, watching their mother tongue die as those children adopted the language of the rustics around them. Of course, it was written in literary Sinitic, and I've tried my hand at translating it into English. It's very short. Is it okay if I sing it? I will, whether you say so or not. From this plain now you say it is going. You will miss placing modifiers first. Please remember our Red River language, that lost tongue in which Dad was well versed. Thank you, John, for
Hello, everyone. I'm Mark Alvis. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Journal of the Southeast Asian Linguistics Society. And although my research spans Southeast Asian linguistics, I've spent a lot of time with Vietnamese for a few decades. And now, as the kind of token historical linguist here, I guess, I'm still going to talk about two very important historical periods. There is the pre-John Phan period and the John Phan period proper, and that's the one we're in now. And in the pre-John Phan period, there were most scholars thought that the Chinese influence was primarily the result of literary spoken transmission, some kind of literary persons who were Vietnamese spreading it. And the model was Japanese and Korean. And I was in that group. And not too many years before John's dissertation, that was the kind of framework that I had in my writings about Vietnamese language history. And I was far from alone. There was, well, that's okay. Then when John's dissertation came out in 2013, and I'd heard about it, and some other folks said, hey, you should take a look at that. And well, I looked at it and I thought, I'm not sure about this yet. But within 2 years, I was publishing and writing about Annamese Chinese because Annamese Chinese because it made good sense. His argument, there had been a brief statement about the idea of a Chinese-speaking community in northern Vietnam in the second half of the first millennium by the very famous Vietnamese linguist Nguyen Thai Cun in 1979 in his seminal work on Chinese Vietnamese, Tu Han Viet, Sino-Vietnamese. But it was John's that gave the first full-throated argument for this, as my two colleagues here have discussed. And after that, I abandoned my wicked ways, and I was able to see that the data that I was looking at, especially in John's book, he talks about what he calls early Sino-Vietnamese, that which is before the Sino-Vietnamese proper, Thu Han Viet, before that period. And I realized that much of that could not be explained very well without a community there, despite the fact that historical records did not provide much information to clarify that. But the more I saw the data and the more it fit, his hypothesis fit, and the more I realized my own data was continuing to support that. And now I've worked with John on his book and nudged him like a terrible gadfly, giving him trouble here and there. But looking at it now, I see the original framework of his dissertation and then a tremendous amount of updates and reworking and numerous editions. And it is absolutely a very fine interdisciplinary work. I think it is an exemplary model of what interdisciplinarity can be. It is challenging in many places, and it will certainly be challenging for people who are not linguists to read that information. But I think the fact that different people from different disciplines are able to talk with great enthusiasm about the value of it means that it has achieved that goal of what an interdisciplinary work is supposed to do. And so not long ago, now I can read it and understand it. It doesn't mean I can keep all of the information in my head. So that's why we have books. And so not long ago, I was working on an article and I found some tidbit in there. And I don't know if it was from the original dissertation. I don't remember that. I think it might be new. But I realized I had to start citing Phan 2025 after citing Phan 2013 for many years. The last thing I'll say is a quote I was looking at when I was taking the train up here. We must imagine political, cultural, economic, and linguistic identities as transforming it at different rates. I think that is an excellent sentence which exemplifies the approach that he has taken in there, taking all of these parts and putting them in recognizing the complex interaction between them to be able to make the statement. And this is clearly a book that will be of value and reference long-term for decades to come by many people who are interested in Vietnamese historical linguistics and Vietnamese language history and Vietnamese ethnohistory broadly. That's what I think. So thank you, John, for contributing the work to many scholars, and I think to the Vietnamese people. I think that is actually worth saying. So thank you very much, John.
Well, if I could blush, I would be blushing. I don't really blush naturally. I'm trying- I don't have that gene, actually.
You don't have that,
No.
okay.
I'll just say a couple words in response very quickly, mostly to thank the very, very kind and generous comments that my colleagues gave. First to David, not only, I want to thank David, first of all, for his class, History of Writing in a Cosmopolitan East Asia, that I took many, many years ago, which was just a standout experience. Yes, took it with Chad, and I've taught it to a couple of people who are here, so the tradition continues. It was a real formative experience, and I also really thank you very much, David, for mentioning at all chapter 4, which is the chapter that deals with literacy, because it was nowhere in the presentation, and often I leave it out because it's difficult to fit into a short discussion, but it is absolutely crucial to the story, you know, to understanding the linguistic landscape of a place that speaks multiple languages and also writes yet another language, you know. So I really, really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And I appreciate that you've connected this work to the broader discussion of vernacular languages, which I feel that it truly is, although, you know, maybe it's not as obvious actually in this first book, but it truly is a piece of that larger discussion. Bob, I loved your story. One of the reasons I loved it is because the Normans are a huge influence on my imagining of the situation for obvious reasons. It is by no means the only example of language shift in the world, but it is one of the best examples because exactly it's so well documented. Like, we're just so lucky that we have an account of the Normans, and they shifted twice, by the way. They were just lovers of language shift, you know, to French and then away from French. Yeah, so they were like bad moves. Couldn't let it out right away. But yeah, it really played a formative role in my imagination of what happened. And so thank you for pointing that out, because whenever I doubt the plausibility of the hypothesis, and I should point out that that Bob is 100% right. This is only a hypothesis until the moment someone finds a document, you know, that has Annamese Middle Chinese written down in some form. That is the only time it will ever turn to anything other than a plausible hypothesis. But the Norman example is a good one because it gives me a little faith that maybe the hypothesis is on the right track. By the way, I haven't given up hope that we would find something like that. So those of you who are maybe going to graduate school, think about doing some serious field work, because that's really needed. I also want to thank Bob for the line about modifiers and modified. That's an excellent line to include in that little ditty. And especially because that is, as I've come to realize, and Mark, we can talk about this later, that what Bob is referring to is that in Vietnamese, modifiers come after the modified. So you say a book read, not a read book. And of course, in Chinese, modifiers come before. And you think that's a pretty simple difference, you would think on the face of it, but it ends up being a very deep syntactic difference. And it causes all sorts of problems when Vietnamese people start writing Vietnamese. So I loved that was a lyric in your, and I would also like a copy of that song, if that's possible. And I have a lot of things to thank Mark for. Mark has been a really important and wonderful colleague over many, many years, not least of which because he was a really fundamental voice in the manuscript workshop that we did on the book a little while ago. And he really, really helped me understand a lot of things. He's been writing not only about Southeast Asian languages in the historical perspective for a long time, but specifically Sino-Vietnamese. So he has really been in a community where there are very few people to speak to. You know, it's really important to have not only someone else, but someone of great intelligence to bounce your ideas off of. So I really appreciate Mark for many reasons. And I also really appreciate that he did quote this idea about different rates of change, because I do emphasize a lot in the book. I shout at people in talks like, language does not equal people, and there's that big, you know, angry exclamation point on the screen. But of course, there are so many connections between language and culture, language and society, language and identity. You know, we create and perform our identities through language, right? So that is the important idea. The idea is that they change, though, at different rates. You know, they don't change in tandem with one another. And the nationalist identity, that idea forces us to think that they're in lockstep. And that's the thing that's wrong. It's not that there is no connection. So I really do appreciate that he brought that up. But most of all, I appreciate just the kindness. So if you have unkind things to say, you can say it once the camera is off. We can talk about it. You know, that's true. You don't have to wait. But thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. And now we will open the floor for questions. Yes.
Hi, Dr. Phan. Thank you so much for this presentation. And I really enjoyed listening to comments from Professor Lurie, Professor Hangs, and Professor Alvis as well. Wait, okay. I have a question. I was wondering why you opened your presentation with the two river deltas, or why you foreground the Red River in the title of your book. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So part of the story is that the territory that stretches from the Pearl to the Red River was administratively a unit for many, many centuries, starting with Nam Viet, and going through until it breaks in half by the end of the Tang Dynasty. So that's sort of the administrative setting for the question of what are the languages here. Now, why is it called Lost Tongues of the Red River, not Lost Tongues of Lingnan, for example? It could have been called something like that. And it's because I'm not sure how far east Annamese Middle Chinese was spoken. So if you look at the geography of that region, this is part of the reason why the Red River Plain was so much more important than the Pearl River until late in history, because they're divided. Pearl River is surrounded by mountains, you know? So, and then this pathway from northern China down into the south, until the medieval period, it veered to the right down into the Red River. So given that sort of pathway, and also given some of the comparative linguistic evidence that we've gathered, it seems that Annamese Middle Chinese is spoken in the Red River and then upward along that mountain path, but not probably eastward to Guangzhou. So I'm not sure about that, but that's the reason why it's called Lost Tongues of the Red River. That said, it's very hard to figure out how far eastward this dialect was spoken, because Cantonese specifically, but the Yue languages in general, explode in late history westward, and they just wipe out everything in their path, just like Mandarin is doing today. So like, if you look at a dialect map of southern China, like, it's like Cantonese is this big flood, and there's just little islands left over from what was there before. So the evidence for the eastward perimeter of Annamese Middle Chinese is very difficult to ascertain. So I don't know if that's what you're asking, but that's one answer to my question. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Who else? Good, there's time for me. So, you know, as I was reading your book and concentrating on the introductions and the conclusion, I didn't have to there's the linguistics so much in the middle. I was thinking a lot about current affairs, right? Because when Trump asked for the Middle East and South Asia and African Middle Department to be taken under receivership, the response of the university was to put all the regional studies programs under receivership, or under some leadership. So, you know, and I think, frankly, Katrina probably lost her job over the way that was worded. But I think, your book, despite being, going back 2,000 years and thinking about these nationalist histories is really important for regional studies today. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you see what you're doing here as, potentially breaking. I mean, our department was founded before there was regional studies, but it really grew under, post-war regional studies divisions, and now it's growing in new ways. I think my own position, Tibetan and Vietnamese, have kind of broken it out of that old Cold War mentality, thanks to well, Maddie, you started it, bringing me here, and I know that Bob and Haro and others have helped, bring your hang and so forth, bring your position here. So I'd like to hear, how do you think it, reimagines or could help break down the regional studies divisions?
Thank you. That's a question I really care a lot about. I also grew up in a regional studies department. I was in Asian studies at Cornell. So you were too? What? I had no idea. Oh, that's great. Oh, senpai. But yeah, I care a lot about that question. So I think a couple things. One, I think I also get a little bit down and I get a little shouty about the Cold War historical origins of regional studies, but it was a great service. I mean, it was such an important thing to have happened, or to put it another way, it was such an incredibly positive outcome from such incredibly ugly global realities. So I think we should really be grateful for the fuel of the Cold War, in a strange way, to have produced the kind of scholarship that was produced. And so I think that's the first thing to say. I think the second thing to say is you have to be a little Strongsian about it. Like the area studies, the way it was conceived, is of course built on the infrastructure of sovereign nation states, right? It's designed to be that way. In fact, its explicit purpose was to help us understand modern nation states. So of course, the scaffolding of the fields was nationalist in its DNA. I'm mixing metaphors now, but you understand what I'm saying. And I think that there's nothing wrong with that. First of all, because nation states are real, and we have to understand them, and they're real forces in our world. And also, secondly, because all you have to do is understand when and where they came from for you to leap off of that scaffolding. And I think that, especially for those of us who work in early modern or pre-modern times, that's all that is required. It sounds simple, but it does have to be a constant thing, because your brain will slip into modernist thinking all the time. You just have to have like a rubber band on your wrist or something. But that's all it takes. And I think that I think there's a great promise then, in area studies, because the thing that happened as a result is this great respect for regions. And as long as you don't get dogmatic about what defines the region, admitting regionality is super important. It's super informative, and the things that have been happening lately, especially in early modern or pre-modern studies, has been the discovery of new kinds of regions, like new orbits, new configurations, like, Erica Brindley's Maritime Southeast Asia, and places like that don't conform to nationalist lines, but we can show historically we're real, So I think taking the idea of area studies and then just, remembering that nation states are real, and then, jumping off of that scaffolding is very promising. And I would say that's also true for, you didn't ask this, but I think that's also true for disciplines like interdisciplinarity, like that's also the attitude we should take with regard to disciplinary, methodologies. So I think in that sensibility, the future should be very bright, for area studies. Yeah, I don't know. And if you, knock on wood.
Thank you.
So having some time to sit down and read. Thank you. Read your book. It sounds, I was able to kind of flip through the introduction like Gray. One question that I wanted to ask you was, this sounds phenomenal in terms of what you've kind of documented in terms of this linguistic shift, right? This language shift and transformation from kind of the bilingual context of Annamese Middle Chinese to more monolingual. And you're doing this very, very deep, long durée history that is primarily linguistic, right? Looking at and phenomenally reconstructing this language based on what it sounds like very, very little data. So it simply sounds, so compelling. Do you at all in your book talk a little bit, I mean, you kind of give us a sense of kind of administrative borders. I mean, you want to defy and throw out national borders. Indeed, that's part of, your rejection of national languages and national peoples and national borders. But you do give us a sense of kind of the shifting political boundaries. So do you at all sort of, what is like, probe a little bit about the historical context that might have led to this really fundamental shift? Is it simply a political one? I mean, I can imagine all sorts of reasons why, despite political boundaries changing, the ongoing fluency of bilingualism and so on and so forth. So that's one question. And then the other question is based on David's discussion of, I'm very interested in the notion of vernacular, and of course, Shang Wei's work is fabulous on this. So, what is, and the segmentation between vernacular as a kind of a literary phenomenon, separating it from the spoken, right, is so important. So, how do you situate? I mean, David kind of alluded to it, but since we haven't, not all of us have read your book, like, how are you situating your study vis-a-vis kind of ongoing discourses on the vernacular in the early modern period?
Okay. Thank you, Eugene. Those are two excellent questions, really difficult questions. So, the first question, I guess you could rephrase the first question as like, why did it die? Like, why did the shift happen? So I do treat this in the conclusion. There's a little section that is, I think it's called "Why Did It Die?" And it's largely speculatory, but I think in fact, of course, administrative boundaries had everything to do with it. Something that I learned from Shelley's book, Shelley Pollock's book on the cosmopolitan vernacular, is that, I mean, I'm putting words in his mouth and I'm making it a stronger statement than he made it, but every linguistic change is a change of power. It really is. It really has to do with power. And it's always, if there's a thing like the death of a language or the acquiring of a new language, there's a practical reason why it happened. And it's driven by these practical conditions. So we have to just seek for what the practical conditions were that led to someone favoring Vedic over Annamese Middle Chinese. And it's not a coincidence, of course, that you can't ignore that there was a new kingdom, right? So I think that in the book, I outlined just a couple baskets of factors. So the first is, of course, just demographically, after the fall of the Tang, you don't have regular governorship anymore, which means you don't have a Chang'an appointed governor with his entire retinue coming down every X number. I think it's every 4 years. So that is a huge number of people that would regularly come down, that would presumably reinvigorate the language, and would also presumably give you a lot of sociolinguistic impetus to speak the language. And that's different than studying for the civil service exam, because you don't need to speak the language to study for the exam, but to get in with the governor, you have to speak the language. So that's a huge demographic difference. And then another demographic difference is that the major thing that happened over the Tang is that Guangzhou rose up because of new routes to the north and to the south. So Guangzhou becomes, the major port of the south. And therefore one imagines that maybe, and this is something that Li Tana, a historian, has worked on, Sinitic speaking mercantile communities they don't have to go to the Red River Plain anymore. They can go straight from Southeast Asia or straight from Guangzhou down to Southeast Asia and back. So that also removes another impetus potentially to be speaking Sinitic. The third thing that I think is relevant is that, and this does not start in the 10th or 11th century, it goes back further. The power structure of Annam, and before that even Zhaoji, was a great clan structure. So if you go back to like the 6 dynasties period, the early medieval period, it's more like northern China than it is like southern China, where you had a kind of literati class growing up. You had entrenched clans, and some of those clans almost certainly were also bilingual, but maybe their first language was Vedic as opposed to Annamese Middle Chinese, the ones particularly on the periphery. And we do have evidence of repeated incursions from large clans from the periphery into the Red River Plain, and then they get ousted by the Red River Plain like elite. And then they come back in. And then they get ousted, and then they come back in. And if you think of that as a repeated cycle all the way through these centuries, and then at a certain point, you're no longer part of the empire, your impetus to speak Vedic is rising as your impetus to speak Middle Chinese or Chinese is reducing. So I think that those are three of maybe many factors that led to a difference in the impetus. But whatever it was really slow, and you have to think about it as many generations to the point where you have a generation that is just like the children are like, I just don't want to speak Chinese anymore. And also I think, who was it? Oh, you mentioned the Norman example, like I'm so grateful for this, for raising the Norman example, because the other thing to think about is that there are also types like dialects, or, to borrow David's term, not realms of literacy, but realms of language, that also died out. So like, one of the grammatical forms of Middle English, like that was Norman proximate, was the ne pa form of English, where you'd like, I ne eat, kale. I ne eat kale pa. You can say that. And it was something that was said, or at least written, and there were probably forms like that. There were probably many intermediate generations where there was more Sinitic forms of speaking like that, and those things eventually fall out too, until you finally get, Vietnamese essentially. So it's a really excellent question. The second question is even harder about vernacular. So one thing I'll say about the way vernacular, it's really blossomed into a really interesting, and powerful tool. So I think people are using it in many different ways, in a great way. And in a lot of historical work, it's being used to talk about sort of ground level operations, like that are not top to not metropole looking outward or central looking to the periphery, but sort of like on the ground level of how things are working. And I think that's a really useful application of the concept of vernacular. Like in the linguistic, or in the sort of in the Palokian original sense, it is a division. It was sort of Sheldon responds to like the concept of diglossia, really, right? And I think, like, for me, one of the important things, just on a very general level, is when you're looking at a big empire like the Tang or the Han or any of these empires, there must have been this huge variety of spoken language, and also probably not a clean. I think one of the interesting things to say is that the division between the spoken language, or whatever those spoken languages were, and the written language is the one that we can most reliably point to. And the work that chapter 4 is doing, that David alluded to, is pointing to potentially a historical process whereby the written language, the universal written language, is defined culturally. It is conceived of as a thing that you can reliably point to and maybe imagine as constant, even though it's not actually constant. And then beyond that, you have this just constellation of vernaculars, right? And one interesting thing about those vernaculars is that the line between someone who's speaking a Chinese vernacular and someone who's speaking a non-Chinese vernacular it's not going to be clear in the mind of the speaker. It will be clear at a certain point in culture, like a certain cultural point or level. It becomes actually a point of discussion, very famously, like you look at Sejong, when he invented Hangul, he's like, oh, our sounds are different, But you could also imagine someone from Fujian being like, oh, our sounds are really different, and basically coming to the same conclusion. And the genealogical reality is irrelevant, So I think one thing that I'm interested in is the way the difference of vernacularity is conceived by the speaker. And of course, I don't go into it in this book, but practically speaking, we see a real shift in that in Annam, from having a Sinitic, well, maybe more relevantly, from having at least 2 major vernaculars to having just one vernacular, And I'm sure, another person who works on something like this is Mana, who works on, well, she works more on multiple cosmopolitans, but she also works on the conceptualization of these sort of linguistic modes, which I think is an interesting idea. But there's many other things that have to do with vernacular, but I'll leave it there because it's too rich of a question. So thank you, Gina.
Hi, Vanessa, and I'm glad to be back to your class. So I was Professor Pan's student last year, so like I remember like hearing a lot of the points we're discussing in the class, and then I'm glad to see all these things you have done have come together to form the book. So I also remember we actually like compared all those languages like Chinese, Korean, Japanese together, Vietnamese together. We read like you were the Vietnamese guys and I was the Korean guy. I actually got a Korean analect like later, and I found out my Korean pronunciation of those Chinese characters were terrible. So, but anyway, I remember you talked about your like early projects in Vietnam, like studying other like Austro-Asiatic languages, such as if I remember correctly, is it called the Moon language? Yeah, and also. I just wonder, like, do you find any kind of like Sinitic influence, like this kind of process, also not only like going through the Northern Vietic, but also entering other languages in the region as well, like other like languages belonging to the Vedic family, or like other families as well, like Kradai or like Austronesian, or for example, like the Champa language or other language families? Like, and have you, if you have not, like, is it within your plan to look at it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Maybe Mark has something to say about this question as well. I did my field work on 3 dialects of Muong. So there's a really complicated question because there's a couple factors at work. And one of the big factors is exactly as you suggested. One of the big factors is the Kradai language family, because the Kradai family exerts enormous influence over virtually all of the Northern Vedic languages. And other than the lexical effect, like the phonological, typological effects, they're almost indistinguishable from Sinitic influence. So because typologically, Kradai and Sinitic are very similar, So that's a really complicating factor. So the simpler answer is if you do a lexical analysis of the Hmong languages, yes, almost certainly. There's a dramatically lower number of Chinese words in the Hmong languages. There are Chinese words in Hmong languages, but a lot of those words are from Vietnamese. So, and you can usually figure out. So one of the easiest ways to tell in the book, there's a chain of mutations that changes the initial onset. And that's one of the major things that mutated Vietnamese phonologically from Hmong. So if you get a word, say with, that is a nasal, but it should normally be an implosive in Hmong, then probably that word, which is of Chinese origin, is borrowed from Vietnamese. So you can tell a lot of the words are like that. But I have not done a systematic analysis of Sino-Hmong words. I did a little bit of analysis of them, but one should not be surprised that there is a Sinitic influence on Hmong, especially the northerly Hmong languages, because it's a dialect continuum, right? So the influence of Annamese Middle Chinese should have influenced all of the languages in the region to greater or lesser degrees. And it should not also surprise us that when you go as far south as the Southern Vedic languages, you don't have really any influence by the Sinitic languages, The thing that's more confusing is the phonological typology of the languages, because almost all the Northern Vedic languages are kind of mostly monosyllabic and kind of mostly have tone. And those are major typological features of both Kradai and Sinitic, right? They're both monosyllabic and tonal languages. So there's 2 things that are confusing here. One is that you don't know whether it's Thai or Sinitic influence on those languages, including Vietnamese. And 2, for example, if you look at tonogenesis and monosyllabicization, I'm getting a little in the weeds right now, but those processes happen very late in the history of Viet Minh. So Vietnamese itself was syllabically complex until the early 2nd millennium. But as with all phonological change, there's a lag. There's a lag between the contact and because all you get when you get especially a complex phonological change is you get a nudge towards the direction of the change under the structural conditions of that change. So say tone comes from differences in the consonants, right? So if you have a voiced versus a voiceless initial, like you can you can change that difference in many different directions. But if you have a lot of people who realize that difference in terms of a higher versus a lower pitch, then maybe that starts you on a long process that will eventually give you two tones. So that explains, you can still get tonogenesis centuries later in a language, and it can still be the product of contact, especially if that contact has been consistent all the way through that time. So, but for that reason, it's difficult to suss out exactly the chronology and the source of those influences in Northern Vedic. All we really know is that Northern Vedic has these features in common. But it's very striking that beyond the reach of the Kradai and Sinitic families, none of the languages have those features. So, I mean, it's difficult. Wait, what's that eyebrow? I saw an eyebrow. Yeah. I mean, if you look at the Vedic languages, certainly true, right? Things are changing, obviously now, right? But of course, it's very difficult because now you've had Vietnamese influencing all those languages for a long time, right? So, you know, but I think if you look at history, if you look at the typological differences between the Southern and Northern Vedic languages, it lines up very, very nicely, you know, with the story of influence. Want to say something? Do it. Blood on the floor. No? No? Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. It's a difficult question.
Hello, thank you so much, Professor Phan, and everyone else. I'm very grateful to have been in class with two of you. One thing that that I really loved about this book is that it's not just the origins of the Vietnamese language, it's also about the changing fortunes of literary Sinitic, especially in chapter 4. You get into that. And it's also about spoken varieties of Chinese in the Southwest. So it's really speaking to Larry's comment about it being kind of five in one, or however many in one. My question, I have a question for Professor Phan and then one for Professor Larry as well. My question for you, Professor Phan, is kind of a personal question about the genesis of this work and asking about the first moment when you realized that the borrowings you were seeing, like the LSV borrowings you were seeing, could not be attributable to some sort of standard, standard tongue Middle Chinese. I mean, you problematize that concept itself in the book, but I'm just curious about the first time you realized that there must have been a population of Sinitic speakers in the Red River Plain itself. And then my question for Professor Lurie has to do with what this work means for those situations in which there is no bilingualism and it's actually truly hyperglossic, in the sense that what sort of questions will this work raise for those working in those settings, and what will it sort of reveal about how those are different or unique? And that's my question.
Thanks, Andreas. That's a great question. I actually do remember the exact moment. I was sitting with a colleague of Mark and I, Joe Patayapur. So we were sitting, Joe is an expert of Kradai, historical linguistics. And we were sitting in a cafe. Oh, Maddie's gone, so I can't reminisce with her about the cafe, but at Cornell, and I was talking over these, in the book, the argument boils down to 6 phonological kind of characteristics. And I was trying to talk through like how this complex of characteristics could have come from, like what literate sort of model, like what classroom dialect could have given us these 6 features. And a couple of them are particularly difficult. The 2 that are the most difficult are the high series sonorant, high series tones and sonorant initials, and this diphthongization that happens in some of the vowel nuclei. And I couldn't figure out, like Joe and I were talking back and forth, like there, and then I was like, oh, it must have been a living language. Like, in that moment, like it becomes very easy to understand why these 6 different features that are not anywhere together anywhere, actually exist, because all you have to do is draw a circle around them and say, that's the dialect, that's the donor, like that's the dialect. that must be the dialectal donor, right? It's always, and I said this in a lot of other talks, it's always possible that there is a Buddhist that existed and he taught, a couple of people this precise, phonological pronunciation. That is a possibility, and again, if someone finds that, good. Yeah, so not only so good, I will give them the book so that they can burn it. I mean, that's a really good, that would be an extraordinary find.
Yeah.
That's also hopefully, but even in that case, I would be really surprised because if you look at, especially those two features I mentioned and the way they get realized in Vedic, they look like they're the contact of two spoken languages. They're not a rote learned reproduction of something that is fossilized. So that was the moment, and it's a good example because Joe is also like a really critical colleague of mine, although he doesn't work on Vedic. Like he's a brilliant historical linguist, and like you really do need people to talk to like figure things out, So yeah, thanks for asking that question. That's nice. Oh, sorry.
Thanks, Andreas. I don't want to go into this for too long. I think it's almost premature to say. I think it will take time for all of us who work in this area to digest this book. But the two things come to mind. One is that it's related to something that John said earlier when he was responding to Eugenia's question about vernacularity, that it's really important to think about the fact that the speakers of these two languages in their bilingual society were not necessarily thinking that one of them was speaking a language closer to literary Sinitic and the other one was speaking a language farther away from literary Sinitic. We tend to make assumptions about that, but especially given the paucity of thinking in terms of grammar in this particular area of linguistic thought, I mean, it's the rankest speculation to imagine what they were thinking, but the possibility that they simply imagined literary Sinitic as the sort of written language that had multiple vernaculars associated with it throughout East Asia, and that they just happen to have these two local vernaculars is very provocative. And I think it's important. And that's another way of relativizing the Chinese spoken side of the whole large regional story. The other thing I'll say very quickly is that I've had a tendency in my own scholarship, I talk about this exegetical network where the written tradition, literary Sinitic, comes with meta-linguistic tools that allow it to kind of function across all different kind of language communities. And I've tended to slight the spoken side of the exegetical network where it's focusing intently on the pronunciation of characters. And I think John's chapter 4 goes a long way to remedying that and to really bringing, I mean, the typical way to talk about the kind of meta-linguistic tradition in Chinese is that there's talking about the form of the characters, talking about the meaning of the characters, and talking about the reading or sound pronunciation of the characters. And John is really giving us a way of integrating the pronunciation side with the other two into a kind of larger kind of trans-regional understanding of what is the meta-linguistic architecture that allows literary Sinitic to function across many different languages. And I think that that's a truly crucial contribution.
Do we have time for one more question? So, it was interesting because David suggested your work is very brave, and I was thinking that as I was reading it. But Mark suggested that the Vietnamese people should be thankful for your work on this. So how do you, like what kind of reaction do you get, and or do you imagine you could get in certain, we have, the president of Vietnam comes to Columbia. I don't know if he's read your book yet, but yeah, you should send him a copy. I can imagine that people would be really upset by what you're saying. I mean, maybe not if they really read it all and digested it all and could really understand that, yes, there's no Chinese and no Vietnamese, but so
Yeah.
right. So I'd love to hear like how it's been received, what you imagine in certain settings it would be like.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, I just got back from Vietnam. I gave a bunch of talks in Vietnam last week, so I'm ready to answer this question. I think the first thing to say is, though, and this is something I say in Vietnam or to Vietnamese audiences a lot, and I say it in my class all the time, I'm not being hard on Vietnam. You know, like imagine saying the same thing, you know, to a French person about French, or, you know, to a Chinese person about Chinese. Like language is emotional, you know, and especially, you know, in the modern world. And it's precisely because we perform who we are through language. So it's hard to disentangle that and to see language as a historical object, you know? I don't want to give the impression that Vietnamese people are sensitive. Like humans are sensitive about this topic. You know, it's just a sensitive topic. And the second thing I'll say is that I had an incredible reception in Vietnam just now, probably mostly because of the kindness of my hosts. And I've been to the depths of the internet. I know what people are saying about my work, you know, and there are a lot of haters of my work on the internet. But I think, you know, the thing that I think makes this a palatable thing to any of us who care about our language is that, like, you can have your cake and you can eat it. You can love Vietnam and the Vietnamese language, and you can recognize this, because in the end, it gives you a richer portrait of the language. It gives you a richer portrait of the identities that you have access to as a Vietnamese person in the modern moment. And I think that's the message about nationalist identity. Like, nationalism is important. It's not a bad word. It played an important role, especially in modern history. But also, it's a little bit of a pigeonhole, and we can value it for what it is and what it's done, and we can then let it go. And then it allows you then to, like, appreciate this incredibly rich, open thing, you know? And I think I think that's the important message about a book like this. I'm not trying to tear down somebody's identity, but in fact, if you read the book the right way, it enriches your identity. You know, it enriches it. And I think that's the message to put forward.